To welcome him, he will do his introduction. Mr. Charles Cleveland, thank you for coming.
Thank you, Eloise. Thank you for the Grand Traverse Band for having me today. It's my privilege to talk today about treaties, and particularly the Treaty of 1836, which is so important for this area of Michigan. And by this area, I mean 1/3 of our state, which, for which the land of 13 million acres was acquired by the Treaty of 1836 between the United States and the Odawa and Ojibwe people that occupied this area. I'm talking roughly north of the Grand River, west of a line between, say, the headwaters of the Grand River and Alpena, everything west of that, and all of the western part of the Upper Peninsula from about Marquette to the east. So it's a huge territory and important in our history. I have a great deal of regard for you in the audience who gave up this wonderful day to come here and listen to me talk. You must have more curiosity than regard for recreation. So thank you for coming. And I wanted to start talking a little bit about treaties in general, because most people don't think about treaties. We hear about the Panama Canal Treaty and so forth and so on. Occasionally we hear about these. Treaties are made possible under our Constitution, which gives the responsibility of treaty making to the President with the advice and consent of the Senate. The treaty as a legal form is very old in Western society. It goes back to the time of the Egyptians and the Hittites, who apparently made the first known treaty between the two of them. And the treaty in that context, I mean in the Western context, has evolved, of course, over many years. And it has a treaty has certain requirements to give it legitimacy. And as far as the U.S. was concerned, in the case of Indian treaties, these requirements are that the treating parties are sovereigns. That is, that they are responsible for the content of the treaty and are responsible for the enforcement of the stipulations of the treaty. Also, in that context, the treaty is a written document, essentially a contract between two parties. And of course, when I say a written document, that in the context of American Indian treaties meant the English language. And as I've already said, these documents, when they're negotiated, were negotiated by a treaty commissioner who was appointed by the President. And then the treaty itself had to be run by the U.S. Senate for its approval. And the Senate could modify the treaty or approve it. If the modifications were severe, then there was a requirement that it go back to the Indian party in order to be approved by the Indians as well. Now, as far as the Native American side of the treaty making process, there was a tradition there too. Not a well-known tradition, but we do know some of the components of treaties made between Indian tribes. And first of all, they were oral contracts, not written contracts. Usually these treaties were between people that had a hostile relationship to each other. That is, they weren't related or were very, very distantly related. Say, for example, between an Ojibwe and an Iroquois or Menominee band, something like that. Then they had to be negotiated by mutual kin. That is, they had to be done in the context of a kinship system, so that there were relatives on both sides of the treaty party. Now, once the treaty was made, even though it might be for a short duration, it implied that there was all kinds of exchanges between those two groups. Economic exchanges, political exchanges, and perhaps most importantly, marriage exchanges, because during those periods of peace, there were also intermarriages between the two tribes, and those intermarriages produced people who were the basis for further treaties between the two tribes. That is, that they were kin, and so intermediates. The 1836 treaty, which I want to talk about specifically, of course, had these two sides. And in order to understand the two sides, we need to understand a bit about what those people were like at the time of the Treaty of 1836. Americans on the one hand, Ottawa and Chippewa on the other hand. And you'll have to excuse me for going back and forth between Chippewa and Ojibwe and Ottawa and Odawa. The reason being because in the 19th century, we used the terms in these treaties of Ottawa and Chippewa, but nowadays we use forms that are more appropriate to the languages themselves. So, in 1836, at the time of the treaty, there were about 20,000 native people in Michigan, and about 6,000 of those were people that lived on this ceded territory. That doesn't sound like too many people, and it's not. That is 6,000 Ottawa and Chippewa people, and they lived on this 13 million acres that I described. So the territory that I've already told you is where they lived, and they lived in small bands. A band is a group of kin. The bands were usually between 50 and 200 people in size, but averaged out at around 150 people, or about 30 families, and those families were related to each other. Bands had territories. Those territories were places where they used the resources and where they moved around with season to exploit whatever resource was at hand at any given time. If we divide the 13 million acres by 6,000 people, we come out with a figure of about 3.4 square miles per each person, or 2,166 acres. And that, keep that number in mind because we will come back to it later. Well, what were these people like in a cultural sense? I've already said that they had their territories, they had their principal villages, they were kin in these bands, and they interacted. There were no tribes. Tribes is totally an invention of the United States. There were no tribes. Yes, Native people recognized that there were neighboring bands that had similar customs and spoke similar dialects, but there was no political organization that would anywhere near approach what we call a tribe today. All of their economic relationships, all of their political relationships were based upon the band, the small group of people. And this included the Treaty of 1836. If you look down the list of the chiefs that signed the treaty, as you can do at the back of that handout that I provided to you, you will see that there are only a relatively small number of individuals and areas that are listed there. And those are the names of the bands. Now in 1839, Henry Schoolcraft did a house by house, wigwam by wigwam if you prefer, family by family census of the Odawa and Ojibwa. And this is the figure that they came out with, which is probably a little shy. I sometimes say between 5,000 and 8,000, somewhere in there, but 6,000 as a round number. So of these Ojibwe and Odawa people, we have a culture that is totally foreign to us, any of us, even today's native people. It was based upon, for example, their economy was based upon reciprocal giving. People did not accumulate things. One person had pretty much the same stuff as everybody else in the society. The giving of food and implements and labor was a giving of presents, and those presents made people feel good, like we all do when we get a present. It created goodwill and the requirement of a reciprocal exchange, so it bound the whole society together. It also put emphasis on the group, not on the individual. It was a necessary kind of economy for people that live off the land. Another thing that was necessary was that people move around a lot. If you are depending upon resources as they become available in nature, that is, blueberries get ripe, fish spawn, deer yard up, and so forth, then people have to move between those resources when they are at maximum abundance. And that's the key to living as a hunter and gatherer. Movement and gift giving. Those two things make it possible. These were also kinship societies. Everything I emphasized that people did or thought about had to do with kin. How you addressed a person, how you exchanged gifts with a person, all your obligations, your customary etiquette, that all had to do with the relationship between you and this other person and what your kin relationship was. If you encountered a stranger that you didn't have a kin relationship with, then you made one up. It was a fictive relationship, and that was very common. There had to be a mechanism, and that was what it was. So it was an important relationship, even though it was fictive. As far as politics were concerned, here again, kinship was very important. An ideal leader was a person who was wise, therefore old, who had had a lot of experience. It was a person who was experienced. It was a person who was generous. It was a person who was able to give sage advice to others. And it was a person who had the welfare of the community at heart. That's what made an ideal leader. A person that was ambitious, that had a lot of stuff, was a person that others despised. It was not a person, that's so common today, I might add, that people look up to. It was a person that destituted themselves for their fellow man and women who were actually thought of as leaders. And here I'm talking about civic leaders. There was another kind of leader. These were war leaders that would be more, we might think of that kind of a leader as a Secretary of State that dealt with foreign affairs, as opposed to a civic or a peace chief who dealt with the affairs of the society. And of course, these people were extremely religious. They were animistic in their beliefs. They believed that everything had a soul, a spirit, a body, and a shadow. And those three parts were rather mysterious. They were all part of the body, in the body. They were things that the body and the spirit and the shadow could come apart, could appear in different ways. And some of those ways were put the person in great risk. For example, if the spirit and the body were to be separated, like in a dream or in a drunken state maybe, that put the person at great risk, because if that became permanent, then the person would die. And by the way, our custom in modern society of saying God bless you when somebody sneezes is based on exactly the same concept, because it was thought that when you sneeze, your spirit could come out of your mouth and you would be in that dangerous state. So that's what that was about. Okay, so that's a brief synopsis of one side. The other side, of course, were people from the United States. And in 1836, there were about 175,000 non-Indians in the state of Michigan, most living in the lower tiers of counties. They were primarily farmers, but scattered through this northern territory, there were numerous traders. By 1836, most of them were employees of the American Fur Company, which basically monopolized the fur trade of this region. These people were, I'm talking about the non-Indian people now, these people were basically of European extraction. Many of them were French. Most of them spoke either English or French. French was common until after the War of 1812, and then English began to be more common as when the Erie Canal opened and this area was flooded with new immigrants. The non-Indian people were people who had much different cultural conceptions. They were capitalists, they were Christians, they were people who had a very firm belief that they were by birth superior to other people, and people of other races particularly. They believed very strongly that they had a moral and ethical duty, even a right, to conquer and to bring other peoples to Christianity, to educate them, and to make them civilized. And that was the divide between non-Indians and Indians. Civilized on one side, savage or barbarians on the other. And this belief was based on the theory that people were born that way. It was an innate thing. If you were a Native American person, you were cruel, lazy, savage, and the list goes on and on. All derogatory stuff. You might have been a good hunter, but that's about it. On the other side, if you were a non-native, you were, by definition, civilized, therefore you were peace-loving, therefore you were a farming person, or supported by farming, not by hunting. You were settled on the land, not roaming around like the Indians were, but settled down. You lived in log houses, you dressed in Western clothes and so forth. So that was, you know, how the thing shook out. And the result of that, whites of the 1830s took on a very paternalistic and, I must say, condescending attitude about Native American people. They often used what they thought were Indian metaphors, like how, or they said, you know, something was a long time, it was many moons, stuff like that. And my favorite one, one of my favorite chiefs of that period, although he was from Minnesota, his name's Jabashkum, and he went through a large number of treaties. He was a very wise man, and in the 1870s he was getting quite old, but a representative of the government came through wanting to get his band, which was the Mille Lacs Band, to move to the White Earth Reservation. The Mille Lacs Reservation was perhaps the lushest, most wonderful place you'd ever seen. Huge rice fields, a huge lake full of fish, all kinds of game. It was just a wonderful place. And this government man wanted them to move out to the plains of western Minnesota, to the White Earth Reservations, where they would learn to become farmers. Well, the government man said to Shabashkum and his fellow chiefs, he said, you know, he said, the winds of 60 winters have blown through my hair, and they have turned my hair white, and they have made me wise. And I think the right thing for you people to do is to move out to White Earth. And Shabashkum said, well, he said, you know, the winds of 60 winters have blown through my hair too, and they've turned my hair white, but they haven't blown my brains away.
I'll keep that in mind.
Okay. Treaties. Let's turn to a little more about treaties. Treaties with Native American people were organized by the United States as a way to advance certain policies which they had in order to make peace, in order to remove people from their land, in order to create reservations and so forth. Whatever the objective was, that's why the United States called Indian people to participate in a treaty. They thereby set the subject. They picked the place where the treaty was going to take place. They would often they would always hire the interpreter. They would write the stipulations of the treaty down in English. They would have the interpreter read it to the Indians. And then that was how the treaties were organized. Now, I don't think there's any one of us here in this room that would sell a house or a car under those conditions, where we let somebody else write the contract, which, by the way, we couldn't read. We'd let them tell us by an interpreter through another language what the contract said, and then we would sign away our house or our car. That's just not something that a reasonable person would do, except that in this case there wasn't really any choice, as I will get to in a minute. So it is true that in every case of every treaty, Indians were at a severe disadvantage. what the treaty was or what it was about. Fortunately, the U.S. courts have long recognized that that is the case. And they have also set up what are called canons of treaty construction, which hopefully will balance the scales of justice a little bit when treaty problems arise. For example, one of the canons of treaty construction is that treaties that now are contested must be construed liberally. In other words, you can't go by every comma. It's got to be construed liberally in favor of the Indians. Secondly, if there were any ambiguities in the wording of the treaty, those must be resolved in favor of the Indian parties. Did he think that they, as non-speakers and writers of the English language, did they think they were going to go to the nearest land office and look up in the record books to see if a parcel had been sold? No. They could tell if a parcel was sold, if there was a fence around it, if there was a house on it, if there was a farmer out there plowing the field, then they would know that they couldn't use that land because it was required for settlement. So that was the argument, and that was the argument, by the way, that prevailed in the federal courts. Now, and finally, I hope, I'm getting down to the end here, I want to talk about some of the problems of cultural misunderstanding that evolved in the negotiation of the treaty and what happened subsequently. Let's take, for example, the sale of land. With Americans, with the U.S. government, land was a commodity which is to be divided, which is to be sold in parcels. It was to be used by individuals. Its resources were to be used by individuals. And we're all familiar with that concept because that's what most of us do today. But to Indians, that was not something that they could even conceive about. Not because it had anything to do with intelligence. It had to do with cultural beliefs. To these people, the land was a living, organic thing. It was envisioned as a grandmother earth. And, you know, if you study ecology, you know that they're right about that. That's exactly what it is. And that living cultural thing, or that living organic thing, was to be used by people collectively who had responsibilities to the resources. And those responsibilities were to use it in a proper way, to use it in such a way that those resources would perpetuate themselves and would be there for the benefit of future generations. That's a totally different way to think about the earth around us. And as I've already indicated, I think that way is actually the proper way. I think if we all had that notion, I think it would be much better off, because we've not paid the price for misuse very much yet, but we will. To his credit, Governor Cass, Secretary Cass, did in some of his writings recognize the irony of making treaties for the sale of land from people that really didn't understand nor believe in the sale of land. And it is little wonder that in many treaties, years and years after the treaty was negotiated, people still didn't understand that they had sold the land. They thought that they'd sold the timber, the mineral rights, and other things. But I think mostly in the case of the Treaty of 1836, Native people believed that what they were doing in these in this condition of the land was sharing the land with other people that would be coming in. They were granting permission for non-Indians to come on to this land and to use it and use its resources. But I don't believe that they really ever understood that they were actually selling forever and ever land to be used in this other way. What about the treaty itself? Well, I said earlier that Indians needed to conduct their business in a kinship context, and so one was invented.